Hey, church family. So good to be with you again on this Wednesday as we're picking back up in our study of Jesus' teaching, as we're walking through Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And today we're going to be looking at his words in chapter 5, verses 33 through 37. But before we get into that, I heard a story about a very wealthy woman, very socially prominent woman, who agreed to have an autobiography done of her and of her life. And so obviously that would include her family history. And so after signing the agreement, the author that was going to do the biography started doing research on her background, on her life, on all facets of how she grew up and family life and her lineage and all of those things. And after doing after doing the research, he came up with this rough draft that he then presented to her to kind of look at and look over and make sure everything was according to what kind of she wanted to have put out there. And one of the things he told her was that he had found out that her great grandfather was actually an inmate in one of the most infamous federal prisons in the country, in Sing Sing prison in New York, and that he was there. And ultimately, what happened to him is that he was executed for murder. And so when she found this out, she was blown away. And she said, "Is there any way that you can leave this out of the book, because I don't want anybody to know about the black sheep in my family, especially that being that it's my great grandfather and that he was executed for committing murder." And so, the author said, I think this is part of what makes your story interesting. I really think we should leave it in. And so reluctantly, she agreed, but she said, "Is there any way that you can talk about it in a way that doesn't make it so plain what he did and what happened to him?" And so the author went back to work, and here's what he published in the book. One of her great-grandfathers occupied the chair of applied electricity in one of America's best-known institutions. He was very much attached to his position and literally died in the chair. I think that woman and her request that the author not talk about her family secrets in such a plain way would agree with the sentiments of Lewis Smead, who once said, "In our society, the plain truth often puts one at a distinct disadvantage." And that aversion to dealing with the plain truth is some of what Jesus is talking about in our passage today in Matthew chapter 5, verses 33 through 37. Here's what he says. He says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord.' But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes, and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." So let me just give you a few things to get out of the way when it comes to this passage. First of all, there are some who have taken this to mean that Jesus is prohibiting us from ever taking an oath in a court of law. I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about here. He hasn't given us a rule for how we should conduct ourselves in a court of law, but rather he's talking about how we conduct ourselves in our everyday lives. Secondly, when Jesus talks about swearing here, he's not talking about cursing or foul language. There are other passages that you can go to that talk about that. This is not one of them. And then thirdly, even though Jesus tells us not to swear or to take or to swear on an oath, I should say, there are other scriptures. There are places in scripture where people of God swear on an oath. Abraham, if you remember, swore on an oath. God himself swore on an oath. And so I don't think those are the things that Jesus is talking about. And I tell you those things because I think we need to resist the tendency to focus on technicalities when Jesus is dealing with something deeper here. Because as we've been talking about, he's in the middle of what are 6 real life examples of what it means to live righteously from the heart. And so he's not wrapped up in external behavior technicalities, but rather he's talking about what it means to live righteously from the inside out, to live righteously from the heart. And specifically in our passage today, in these verses today, what it means to live righteously from the heart when it comes to honesty and integrity. Now, today, when we hear someone say in our culture, I swear to God, or I swear on my mother's grave, or I cross my heart, or as God is my witness, or I swear on a stack of Bibles, or anything along those lines, when people say phrases like that, in essence, what they're saying is, believe me. I'm telling you the truth at this moment. I'm telling you the truth this time. I'm not lying. And we use these kinds of phrases to help convince others in the moment that we're telling them the truth. And the fact that these phrases exist and have existed for years and years is evidence to the fact that we live in a dishonest world by nature. We live in a world where everybody knows that people don't tell the truth. We lie, we distort the truth, we manipulate the truth, and because this is so common, we have to come up with clauses to what we say when we really want someone to believe that we're telling the truth. Of course, this is nothing new. Even in Jesus' day, there were people who would take oaths and would swear, things in order to convince others that they were telling the truth. They would swear by heaven, they'd swear by earth, they'd swear by Jerusalem, they'd even swear by the hairs on their head. And Jesus comes along and he says, you need to cut that out. All you need is simply yes or no. And Jesus' idea is for us as his disciples to live lives of such consistent and transparent and simple honesty that there's no need for any clauses in our lives. People can take what we're saying at face value. Our yes is simply our yes, and our no is simply our no. But but then Jesus says at the end that anything beyond this comes from the evil one. For the first time in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus mentions Satan. And I find this interesting because he's gone decently deep into the sermon, 32 verses into the sermon, without bringing up the devil. He's already talked about anger and murder and lust and adultery and divorce, and he hasn't brought up the devil in any of those things. But when he starts talking about the subject of honesty and integrity, that's when he brings up the devil. Anything that's beyond a yes or no, he says, comes from Satan. So what's going on here? Well, I think Jesus is addressing and confronting a few things that may be under the surface, but I think are quite powerful. One is that in swearing and in the oaths, there is a presumption, I guess, at times. Heaven is God's throne, as Jesus says. The earth is his footstool. Jerusalem is his city. It's all God's, in essence, is what Jesus is saying. And to swear by those things, that may this happen to Jerusalem, may this happen to the earth, may this happen to heaven, may this happen to Jerusalem. If what I'm not telling you is the truth, to swear by those things, well, I don't have the right to use those as collateral. They're not mine to begin with. I'm presuming something that isn't really mine. So let me give you an example. Suppose one of your kids is trying to convince some of his friends or her friends that he's telling the truth. And so he says, listen, I swear on my dad's car that I'm telling you guys the truth. And if I'm not telling you the truth, you can have my dad's car. Well, your kid doesn't have the right to do that. That's not his to give as collateral. That's presumptive to think that he can use your car as collateral. By the way, do you remember what happens right before Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount? In Matthew chapter 4, he actually encounters Satan, the devil, in the wilderness, and the devil tempts him. And one of those temptations was that Satan showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to Jesus, all of this I will give you if you will bow down and worship me. Satan acts as though all the kingdoms of the world are his to give. And one of the things Jesus could be saying when he's talking about swearing and oaths here in Matthew chapter 5 is, listen, heaven is God's throne, the earth is his footstool, Jerusalem is his city. And so what are you doing swearing by those things when those aren't your things to use as collateral? They're God's. And swearing isn't just presumptive in that way. It also could be presumptive in terms of us thinking that we have more power than we really have. That may be some of what Jesus is talking about when he says, don't swear by your head because you can't even make one hair white or black. You don't have that kind of power, so don't even go there. But not only do I think is he confronting our presumptiveness, but I also think he's confronting our compartmentalization. It's worth noting that in the Old Testament, swearing and oaths were permitted, provided that they were reverent and that they would be true. Jesus sums up this idea when he says, "You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord.'" And basically, in that culture, that had come to mean that if you swore to do anything, if you swore to do anything for God specifically, you better do it. And if you told somebody and you swore by God, what you're saying better have been true. But here's the loophole that they created. Get this. If you swore to do something for somebody or swore that you were telling the truth and you were careful not to swear by God, but to swear by something else, i.e., heaven or earth or Jerusalem, in their minds, you weren't necessarily bound by God to that promise or bound to others. Jesus goes on to develop this in Matthew chapter 23 in verses 16 through 22 when he says this to the religious leaders. He says, "Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he's bound by his oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on it, he's bound by his oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it, and by everything on it. And he who swears by the temple swears by it, and by the one who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by God's throne, and by the one who sits on it." Jesus is basically challenging the way they had compartmentalized their integrity and their honesty. They would say, well, we're only bound to do certain things that we swear to when we swear in God's name, right? But we're not totally bound when we swear by other things. And Jesus says, listen, you can't compartmentalize. Heaven is God's throne. The earth is his footstool. Jerusalem is his city. It's all God's. It's all attached to God's. God's around it, in it all. God's everywhere. And he doesn't appreciate you using anything of his in order to rationalize your lack of integrity or cloak your deceitfulness. Now, I recognize that in some ways that this stuff may kind of sound a little bit weird to us today. It's kind of hard to wrap our minds around how they thought that swearing by God bound them to a certain promise or an oath, but if they swore by something else, then they weren't bound to that promise or oath. But to be honest, we kind of do the same things even today. I mean, for instance, how many of you, when you were a kid, ever promised somebody something, but then after you promised, you said, just kidding, right? I had my fingers crossed. And then, children from the earliest of ages learn that some promises are more binding than others. And crossing our fingers is one of the earliest forms of compartmentalization, where we think, well, if I just cross my fingers, right, it nullifies the promise. And we say, well, at least we grow out of that, right? But do we? When I was in college, one of the things that we were told by Bible professors and former ministers is that no matter how nice the church is, whatever commitment they make to you, get it in writing. Why? Because everybody knows, practically speaking, something in writing is more binding than something spoken. Now, I'm thankful that I've never had to deal with that, thankfully. The elders that we've had, the leadership that we've had at 20th Street, I don't question that for a moment. But I know that there are others who have been deceived by churches. And on the other end, vice versa, there are preachers and ministers and pastors who have deceived churches. Churches have been deceived by them. And some of you have experienced that in your jobs or in some transaction where somebody says, well, I never told you that, when you heard them tell you that just the day before. But then they say, well, is there any documentation? Do you have it in writing? And then if we don't have documentation, well, we're the ones who are looking the fool, right? Because we live in a world that says some promises are just more binding than others. Let me give you another example, a quick example of how we sometimes compartmentalize. I've actually heard people say things like, well, I better not lie because I'm in church. Or I better be honest because I'm in the presence of a pastor or a minister, right? As if it's wrong in church or it's wrong in the presence of certain people, but everywhere else, well, it's just part of what we do, right? It's no big deal. And there are all kinds of ways that we play games just like that. There are all kinds of ways that we use the truth to keep from concluding what we really know to be the truth underneath the surface. There are all kinds of ways that we manipulate our words to make distinctions and to hide the truth, but here's the deal. God doesn't make distinctions. The reality is that swearing and oaths and those clauses that we often use, at best, they are a reflection of the fact that we live in a culture of deceit and dishonesty. That's part of why we use them, right? We want some insurance policy that people will really believe us in a certain spoken context. But at worst, they can be used as instruments of deception. Because in many cases, they were used then and are still used today to try and deceive and to manipulate people into believing something. And this could be getting to the heart of why Jesus says that anything beyond a yes or a no is from the evil one. And in many ways, what was going on in the wilderness with Jesus and Satan, and even going on back in the Garden of Eden, all the way back in Genesis chapter 3, was that the enemy was using something of God's in an attempt to deceive. Satan quotes Scripture in an attempt to lure Jesus to leap off the highest point of the temple. In the Garden of Eden, the enemy takes a tree that God creates and he weaves it into a temptation for Eve, and he deceives her and he deceives Adam. That's why Jesus says of Satan in John chapter 8, verse 44, he was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there is no truth in him. When he speaks his native language, for he is a liar and the father of lies. And maybe this is some of what Jesus is getting at, because in that culture, swearing and oaths were really becoming cloaks for deception. And deception is the enemy's oldest way of operating. It's his native language. He's the father of lies. And when you think about it, this broken world that we live in, so much of it is broken as a consequence of a lack of trust and a lack of honesty. And a lack of trust is present because we live in a world of lies and deception. And we ourselves operate that way. And Jesus says all you need is simply to say yes or no. Anything beyond that comes from the evil one. I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Liar, Liar, but in the movie, Jim Carrey plays an attorney who lies often and he lies well. And like children so often do, his son sees right through him. And so on his son's birthday, his son makes a wish as he's blowing out his birthday candles. He makes a wish that his dad could do nothing but tell the truth nonstop for 24 hours. And so the rest of the movie is just this all-out comedy about a liar who suddenly can't tell anything but the truth. And part of what makes it so entertaining is that Jim Carrey goes into these physical and emotional convulsions, doing everything he can to keep from speaking the truth and fighting the truth coming out of his mouth. But that son's wish for his dad probably isn't all that far removed from God's wish for all of us. Can you imagine a world where everyone's yes really was a yes and everyone's no really was a no? Can you imagine how much money that would save corporately and politically? Can you imagine how much pain that would save in our marriages and in our relationships and in our families and in our churches? I mean, what would that be like? And Jesus says to us, I want you to envision a world with me where a simple yes means yes, and a simple no means no. And then I want you to help me build it by allowing me to build it from within you, from the inside out. Of course, that's not easy, is it? And so I hope you'll join me tomorrow as we talk about how we do that. But until then, I hope you have a blessed day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks.